Hello and welcome. Welcome to our annual Leavey Presidential Chair Lecture. This is always such a wonderful evening and an enriching evening for our community and for the university. My name is Jill Bickett. I'm the director of the doctoral program here in Educational Leadership for Social Justice. I'd also like to introduce the associate director. Carrie, where are you? There she is, our associate director, Dr. Hookting. And we are so proud of our program here, and we're proud of our graduates because it builds transformative leaders in education, something that we need now more than ever. And we're very proud of the work our graduates do in the field. I'm here tonight because I want to introduce Dr. Mary Mccullough, who is the interim dean here in the School of Education. She has served as the Associate Dean for Faculty and is a professor in educational leadership. She's held several leadership positions, including department chair, the inaugural director of the doctoral program, and faculty senate president. Professor Mccullough earned her Ph.D. in policy, planning, and administration at USC and has had a distinguished career as a principal and assistant principal in public and Catholic schools prior to joining LMU. We are most grateful for her advocacy and leadership of the doctoral program, and we are proud to call her our foundress, which she doesn't like. Dr. Mccullough, please.
Thank you, Dr. Bickett, and thank you for your leadership of the doctoral program. Really appreciate it. We're very excited to welcome you tonight. It's an honor for me as the interim dean to welcome you, students, faculty, colleagues from across the campus, to join us for this amazing event. And before I introduce Dr. Antonia Darder, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Leavey Presidential Chair in the School of Education, so that you have a sense of the rich history of this chair and the work that Dr. Darder has done. Established in 2014, the Leavey Presidential Chair Lecture provides a community forum where prominent scholars in the field can critically engage in a variety of ethical and moral questions in ways that can move us toward greater emancipatory life within schools and the larger society. This is at the heart of the School of Education mission, to engage in collaborative work with schools and communities, particularly with regard to public policy and social justice, in the efforts of teachers, researchers, and leaders. Through Antonia Darder's leadership, we are now holding our 6th annual Leavey Presidential Chair Lecture, and are thrilled to have such a distinguished speaker tonight joining us, Dr. Shawn Ginwright of San Francisco State University. Dr. Ginwright will be discussing his work that proposes a new movement of healing justice to repair the damage done by the erosion of hope and structural violence in the lives of African American youth. As Dr. Bickett mentioned earlier, this work is important and more important now than ever for the students in our region and beyond. So we are grateful for this opportunity tonight. And we are thankful that you are here to join us in this important endeavor and work. It is now my privilege to introduce the famous Dr. Antonia Darder. I'm the foundress, she's the famous.
Yeah.
I know, sorry. In 2011, Dr. Antonia Darder, an internationally renowned Frarian scholar, joined the Loyola Marymount University School of Education as the inaugural Leavey Presidential Chair, an endowed chair in ethics and moral leadership. This distinguished presidential chair was established to ensure that deep conversations about social justice, in theory and practice, would be fundamentally linked to ethical and moral questions. She is the author of multiple books, including Culture and Power in the Classroom and Reinventing Paulo Freire, A Pedagogy of Love, and is co-editor of the International Critical Pedagogy Reader, which was awarded the 2015 Alpha Sigma Nu Book Award. Recently, Dr. Dardier gave a really important talk about her book, about the pedagogy of love in the Philippines, and I was honored to see a videotape of that, and we do have that posted on the website, so you too could view the recent talk that she gave in the Philippines around her work of the pedagogy of love. Dr. Dardier is also an American Educational Research Associate Fellow and the recipient of the AERA Scholars of Color Lifetime Contribution Award, as well as the Ferrari Social Justice Award. Beyond her scholarly work, Dr. Dardier is an activist, a visual artist, who has prepared and participated in a variety of grassroots efforts tied to educational rights, workers' rights, bilingual education, women's issues, environmental justice, and immigrant rights. It is a very rich portfolio that she brings. Her work is significantly important, and her artwork is quite beautiful if you have a chance to see it. We are so grateful to have Antonia with us as a tireless advocate for so many and a great member of our LMU community. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Antonia Dardier.
All right, I am so happy to see you all here, and it's just, you know, it's one of those things where you create it and they will come, and you just have to have faith that people will come. And they usually come to the things that are meaningful to them. What I realize is that you don't have to push people to come to things that are meaningful to them. They find their way. And that's what we have to think about more than anything, is are we doing meaningful work and work that touches the hearts and minds and spirits of the people that are in our communities and that are struggling for children and for students in this country. So I want to introduce this wonderful man, I'm very biased, but this really wonderful, wonderful man, Professor Shawn Ginwright, who is a leading national expert on African American youth activism, and youth development. He received his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley. He's an associate professor of education in the Africana Studies Department and senior research associate for the Cesar Chavez Institute for Public Policy at San Francisco State University. This research examines the ways in which youth in urban communities navigate through the constraints of poverty and struggle to create equality and justice in their schools and communities. In 1989, Dr. Ginwright founded Leadership Excellence Incorporated, an innovative youth development agency located in Oakland, California, that prepares African American youth to address pressing social and community problems. In 2002, he created the Research Collaborative on Youth Activism, a network of scholar activists who study, advocate, and support youth organizing efforts around the country. He is the co-founder of Flourish Agenda, a social impact company that supports schools and community organizations with building the well-being and healthy school climates that our children need. Dr. Ginwright currently serves as on the board of directors for the California Endowment, with an oversight of over $3 billion endowment to improve the health of California's underserved communities. He's the kind of person that we need on these boards. You know, sometimes we get so frustrated with these boards. This is the kind of person we need on these boards. Additionally, he has served on the board of directors for the Institute of Sustainable Economic, Educational, and Environmental Design in Oakland, California, as well as the School-Based Health Alliance. Currently, he serves as the board of directors for Confluence Philanthropy. In 2011, he was awarded the prestigious Fulbright Senior Specialist Award from the State Department for his outstanding research and work with urban youth. He has advised the Ford Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the Heinz Endowment on philanthropic strategies to support young people in urban communities. He also serves on the advisory board for the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning at the Jonathan Fitch College of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts University. He is the author of numerous books, hope and healing in urban education, how activists and teachers are reclaiming matters of the heart, which is on sale at the reception that you can pick up. Black and Afrocentric Reform, Black Youth, and the Promise of Hip-Hop Culture, and is co-editor of Beyond Resistance, Youth Resistance and Community Change, New Democratic Possibilities for Practice and Policy for America's Youth. And in 2010, he published Black Youth, Rising Activism and Radical Healing in Urban America. On a personal note, I say that he's a beautiful person because there's some people who, it doesn't matter if you see them, you know, every few years or that every time you see them, like there's that click, that spark. That's the kind of person that I have found him to be, and always immediately, it's hard to stop us because we get into these deep conversations, philosophical conversations, political conversations, spiritual conversations about the struggle for social justice and what we're trying to do in our communities. So it is with absolute great pleasure that we welcome my brother and colleague, Dr. Shawn Ginwright, to LNU as our prestigious 6th annual Leavey Endowed Chair lecture for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Dardere. That was, I gotta shorten that bio. It is an honor, it's an honor to be here to speak at the annual Leavey Presidential Chair Lecture. Thank you to Dr. Beckett and Dr. Mccullough for your profound invitation to allow me to share some of these ideas about what I think are really some of the fundamental issues that are facing, not only in our schools and not only with young folks of color, but ourselves. I want to start with just a little bit of a caveat. I think that oftentimes we're trained, and particularly here on university campuses, particularly in schools of education, where we believe that what we think matters more than what we feel. And everyone here in this room is going through something. Health issue, concerns about your parents, concerns about income. Everyone here is going through something. But somehow, some way in our own education, our hearts, that which we believe, our emotions have been removed from our ability to transform the lives of young people and transform the lives of ourselves. We believe we can think our way out of this. And we can't. So the questions that we have, the strategies that we develop, the intellectual heft that is necessary to fight for justice, we also have to reclaim our hearts and our souls and our emotions, because it is in that territory, that uncomfortable domain of human existence, where we actually are able to transform the conditions that we live in. And so I say that because I oftentimes believe that, even in my own work with graduate students, that we want graduate students to read the latest theory and to understand the relevance of theory to the current problems of justice facing our society. And in that pursuit of an intellectual journey, I sometimes become guilty of not paying attention to the ways in which my graduate students feel, to pay attention to what they're afraid of, to pay attention to what they want for their own lives. And so I say that as a caveat, that today's talk is not so much about what I think, but it's my experience from working over 25 years with African American youth and their families who are dealing with issues of trauma and poverty. That these issues are existential issues, not strategic ones. And so I use that just as a way to say that I won't be citing theoretical research tonight. I'm going to be speaking from what I see I'm going to be speaking from my heart. You may have heard me tell this story before, and so if you have, forgive me, but I want to open this talk tonight with a story that happened to me about 5 years ago that led me to write the book, Hope and Healing in Urban Education. I was asked to come and speak. I received an email to come and speak at a local prison outside of my home, outside of Oakland, California. And I had debated whether or not I was going to take the invitation. It was a Saturday morning, and my wife had a bunch of stuff for me to do. And so I decided to go ahead and drive out to the prison, which is about 45 minutes from my home. Before I went to the prison, the email said, make sure you don't wear jeans, and make sure you bring your ID, and all this stuff. So I got to the prison, and the email explained that there were about 10 men who had read a prior book that I wrote called Black Youth Rising, and that the men, these 10 men in prison, were from Oakland. And the way in which I talk about West Oakland and East Oakland resonated with them, and they really wanted an opportunity to have a conversation with me about that book. And so as I drove out there, I got to the prison, and the prison guard said, Dr. Ginwright, we're glad you're here. The men are waiting for you in the cafeteria. They're excited. Just show me your ID and follow the instructions as you move through the prison, because it's a little tricky getting to the cafeteria. I showed the correctional officer my ID, and she let me into the gate. And she said, just make sure you follow the instructions. So as I went through the gate, there was another correctional officer that was in a hallway. And the correctional officer said, Dr. Ginwright, I know you're going to the cafeteria. Just follow the red line on the floor all the way to the end of this corridor. So I looked down onto the floor. There are all these colored lines, and I found the red line, and I walked the red line all the way down to the end of the corridor where I was met with a door. And that door buzzed open, bzz, and then I walked through it, and it shut behind me. Boom. And there was another correctional officer there. Dr. Ginwright, I think you're going to the cafeteria. Find the green line on the floor and follow the green line all the way to the end of the corridor. So I looked on the floor, I found the green line, and I followed that green line all the way to the end of the corridor where I was met with a door. And that door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked through it and it shut behind me. Boom. And guess what? There's another correctional officer there. Dr. Ginwright, you're almost near the cafeteria now. Just find this blue line and take the blue line all the way to the end of the corridor. So I found the blue line, and I walked all the way to the end of this long corridor where I was met with another door, and that door buzzed open. Bzzz, and it shut behind me. Boom. But by the time that third door shut, something shifted inside of me. I began to feel the sense of enclosure. I began to feel trapped. I began to feel enclosed. And I began to imagine what these men who I was about to speak to, what they must feel like every day. They can't hug their children. They can't feel the warm sun on their face or smell the fresh rain. These men were in prison. And so as that door shut behind me, I became deeply insecure. What the hell am I going to tell these men? These men are not free. My own freedom I take for granted. So I had prepared some comments and some talks and some talk about the book and the theoretical implications for the book in Black Youth. And so I decided that I was not going to do that. And I took the talk that I had prepared and I kind of crumbled it up and I threw it away. And so as they ushered me to the cafeteria, I didn't have a speech, I didn't have any research, and I didn't know what I was going to say. And so they opened the double doors to the cafeteria, and to my surprise, I had anticipated 10 men waiting for me. But as they opened the door, I was shocked to see 200 men in their orange jumpsuits waiting for me. I was like, wow, I wish I would have told me there's 200 men. So they were excited to see me, right? They all came up to me, man. This one brother's name was Greg. He came up to me, Dr. Ginwright, man, we're glad you're here, man. I'm so glad you're here. My name is Greg, and I've been here since 1987. My heart sank. another brother came up to me. Dr. G, man, we're glad you're here, man. My name is Chris. I've been in here since 1989. And my heart sank. And so one by one, the brothers came up to me and said their name and the year they had entered this place. And each time they told, and each time they said the year and their name, they shared a piece of their humanity with me. And so by the time it was time for me to talk, I didn't have a speech. And so they ushered me up on the stage, and all the 200 men in their orange jumpsuits waiting for me to speak, and I didn't know what to say. And so I got behind the podium, and all I did was speak from my heart. And I talked to them about the challenges of raising my son, who was at the time 15 years old, and my concerns about raising a 6'3" black boy in Oakland for fear of the police. And I explained to them about the challenges as I was having to care for aging parents. And I just began to talk, man, for about 45 minutes about what was going on in my life. And one of the things I shared with them is, I said that you were not whatever brought you here. And that no matter what you did to bring you here, no matter who you harmed or who harmed you, there's always a space to heal. That healing is always available to you. And I said a couple of more things, and then after that, they ushered me off the stage, and they said it was time for the men to go back to their cells. And as they were going back to their cells, I heard a loud, booming voice behind me as I was leaving the cafeteria. Hey, Dr. G. I turned around, and it was a tall brother. He was like 7 feet tall. I was like, what's up, brother? And he was like, man, I just want to let you know, Dr. G, man, those words you shared, man, they really touched me, man. They got to me. I'm like, man, I'm glad whatever I said, had an impact on you. He said, no, I want you to understand something, brother. You see, I'm tall in here, right? I'm big, and everybody sees me as a threat because I'm tall and I'm black. And everybody thinks that I'm a threat to their safety, man, and they try to test me all the time. And a few years ago, I got in a fight in here, and he leaned down, and he had a scar that went across his face, and he said, they cut me bad, bro. But you know what? I healed from that physical wound, and there's something that you said about I always can heal. And I said, well, what is it? What do you mean? What is it that you do to make this place better? And he said, it's difficult living in these conditions, man. So we always have to have something to heal us every day, even if it's a small act. You know what I do? As he said to me. And I said, no, man, what do you do? And he went into his pocket, and the correctional officers were standing around. I was like, oh shit, what is he reaching to his pocket for? And the correctional officers were like, nah, man, it's cool. And he reached into his pocket, and he brought out a little bottle. And he opened the bottle, and he blew bubbles. And the bubbles floated over my head. And my first thought was, did this big brother just blow bubbles in my face in prison? And he said, man, these bubbles heal me, man. I blow bubbles every day to remind me that I can be healed. It reminds me when I was a kid, my daddy used to take me to the park and he bought me bubbles. And so I blow these bubbles and heal myself every day because it's hard living in these conditions. And that if I don't have a way to heal every day, Dr. G, I will go crazy in here. So I blow these bubbles to keep my own sanity, to be well again. That's my right. And so as I drove home that night, I began to really hear his words echo in my mind, right? That what is my bubble story? Right? What are our bubble stories? That we are living in times right now that are highly toxic, dangerous, and grossly unjust. How do we think about the capacity for us to be well? And as he began to talk about his bubble stories, I began to become deeply curious about other people's bubble stories. How do teachers on the south side of Chicago, where young brothers and sisters come to school experiencing profound exposure to trauma, how do they create bubbles? How do they create hope? How do they create healing for those young students. In New York, in the Bronx, how do therapists, how do after-school providers provide a sense of healing for young people who sometimes are homeless? How do they do that? And so in the book, Hope and Healing, I began to collect case studies to really talk about not only the conditions that young people find themselves in, but more importantly, the way in which we rupture that condition to create healing in really unconventional, toxic places. And so I talked to teachers, I talked to youth development professionals around the country to understand how is it that we create healing in our communities. One of the first things I realized in collecting these case studies is that when we talk about healing, we first have to understand that there are challenges. There's challenges to healing the systems that we're in. And so in the book, and Hope and Healing, I try to first talk about, well, what is it, how do we understand the conditions that young people find themselves in? How do we begin to really name and talk about injustice, racism, homophobia, all of these things that saturate young people's lives in ways that don't make them well? And I should say, I'm going to go off script for just a second, is that we cannot expect to create spaces of well-being for young people if we're not well. It doesn't happen that way. And there's a way in which we get trained as professionals, there's ways in which we get trained as academics that we believe that healing is a one-way street. That's something that I could do for young people. This movement that we have around social emotional learning presumes that I can integrate social emotional learning into my curriculum or to my school. But we don't take in seriously consideration the ways in which teachers and the adults that are in those schools need supports as well. We can't create well-being for young people if we're not well. So the question is how do we then begin to understand the conditions? What are the conditions that young people find themselves in, and what are the conditions that we work in? So in the book, I first tried to document that, and I turned to James Scavarino's work, the book that he calls Raising Children in a Socially Toxic Environment. And he says that just like there are physical toxins, if you think of a physical toxin in your apartment or your home or where you work, like asbestos or lead paint. If you're exposed to asbestos and lead paint, over time that physical toxin can make you ill. But if you're not healed, right? If you don't get healed from your exposure to that physical toxin, over time it can become lethal. So just the removal of the toxins doesn't heal you. It just stops the damage. So healing is a process that is intentional. It is not only the removal of illness that's important, but it's the presence of healing that is necessary to transform the systems that we're in. James Scavarino says that just like there are physical toxins in an environment, he says that there are social equivalents to physical toxins. And social equivalents to physical toxins, social toxins are things like fear, shame, uncertainty, stress. All of these things are just as present in the environment and have a damaging impact on the well-being of young people and the adults that support them. Now, Scavarino says that in many ways, social toxins are more lethal than physical toxins because you can't see them, you can't touch them, you can't smell them. We can touch and see and diagnose physical toxins and lead paint, but we can't talk about fear, despite the fact that it shows up in our schools every single day, both the young people and the adults and the teachers that support them. So how do we then begin to, what are some examples of how we can think about social toxins? Paul Farmer gives us another metaphor. He says that it's not just violence, right? He calls it structural violence. And structural violence suggests that inequality doesn't just block opportunities, but it harms, it inflicts wounds, moral and spiritual wounds on those that are the targets of it. That means we can't just think of inequality as somehow a blocked opportunity for young people of color to have access to college. It's not just a blocked opportunity to have access to better housing. but it actually harms and inflicts wounds on those communities. What are those wounds? Those wounds are moral and spiritual wounds about possibility and hope. And I'll talk about it in a second as I move on. But one of the most significant and egregious acts of oppression, it is the most egregious act of oppression, is not simply the blocked opportunities, but it is the destruction of our inability to dream beyond oppression. And as a result of oppression, all we do is try to tinker away at it. But we cannot dream beyond it because our healing has been wounded. What are some examples of our exposures to social toxicity? We remember the summer of 2015 and 16 where African American boys were being hunted by police officers. And to a certain extent, it continues today without repercussion. I remember my own son at the time, 16 years old, who loved to wear hoodies with his friends in Oakland, California, would leave the house at 8 o'clock at night. I was fearful of what might happen to him, because I knew that the police officers don't see him as my little boogie, my little baby boy. They see him as a threat. And so I know that, again, a form of social toxicity that had an influence on me, this was and continues to be. I remember actually my son, I'm going a little off script, my son, when he left off for college to go to UCLA, I was thinking, thank God, right? He's out of Oakland now, right? He's safer. It's not that much safe being in Bel Air, but Westwood, but you see you understand what I'm saying. Another example of social toxicity, we know what's happening on the border and the toxic rhetoric that's being spewed out of the White House and the ways in which the policy is treating immigrant families as if they're criminals. Right? This is toxic. And the consequence of that exposure to social toxins for immigrant families is immigrant families are not taking their children to school, to the dentist, for health, to get milk. All of these kinds of issues have a reverberating impact on our ability to be well in our society. So how do we think about a model then? I try to provide a way to think about a model that we can understand how social toxicity works on us, as well as how it works on the young people that are in our communities. This is a youth worker. This is Mia. And Mia deeply wants to transform schools and have a profound impact on the students that she serves. But what Mia doesn't know is that structural racism, structural violence, homophobia, all of these structural issues have a toxic impact on her well-being, called social toxicity. And social toxins are like rain clouds. They're like toxic rain clouds. Except this kind of rain doesn't just get us wet on the outside. Social toxic rain gets inside of us. The fear, the anxiety, the stress, the disappointment, the uncertainty is inside of us, and we don't even recognize that it's there. And if we do recognize that it's there, sometimes we don't have a process to get it out. And as a result of our exposure to social toxicity, we reproduce some of the same systems that make us unhealthy. So what happens with Mia is that social toxins have an impact at 3 levels. It has an impact on Mia, even though she wants to transform her society at the individual level, but it also has an impact on her relationships at the interpersonal level. But social toxins have an impact at the institutional level, at the school district, the juvenile probation department. And toxicity has an influence on the values, the practices, and the policies of that very institution. And the institution itself then begins to produce its own form of social toxicity that goes back out into society and reproduces itself. And so what we have is an ongoing cycle of inequality and injustice that rain down on us that has a toxic impact on our ability to be well. Now, oftentimes in schools, because of this cycle, oftentimes teachers and educators are largely trained to only focus on the symptoms of these issues, right? What happens, it shows up in the classroom, is a young person is deeply exposed to social toxins, and the teacher is stressed as well, but the only tool that young people have, or teachers have, is discipline. And as a result of that, sometimes we actually exacerbate trauma, we exacerbate the condition of toxicity. So we need a process that allows us to transform the individual, the interpersonal level, and at the institutional level. So how do we begin to do that, right? How do we actually begin to address these issues? I was having a conversation with some teachers at the California Teachers Association about this notion of stress. And I had come across this article in Education Week. And the article basically says, who heals the healers? How do we begin to think about the well-being of young people if in fact the systems of support for the adults that support them are not there? That teachers themselves have stress. And let me just pause for just a second. Here's the problem, and I'm going to go off script, so just, I feel like I'm at home, y'all, so I'm going to just So here's the problem, is that the institutions, what happens when institutions dehumanize us is that they don't see us as, they don't fully support our own humanity, even in our jobs. So we are not just professors. We're not just students. We're not just teachers. We're not just principals, but we're mothers, we're fathers, we're sisters and brothers. We are neighbors. We have a whole humanity that somehow doesn't get supported in these systems. And as a result of not supporting our humanity and only focusing on the professional, we cut out the full potential of that human being. Teachers go get professional development, not transformative growth, right? But by focusing on the human transformation, guess what we get? We get a damn better teacher. Because the teacher becomes healed. Uh-oh, see? The teacher becomes healed and therefore can show up in more profound ways for his or her students. And so we need a different system, one that allows us to evolve in a way that sees us as fully human, that supports the well-being in ways that transform not just the professional aspects of our lives, but that transforms our entire humanity. So this is another article that came out about the deep teacher shortage that we have in California. We know that there's a shortage of teachers. And what I found interesting about the study is that the reason that teachers say they're leaving the profession, the reason wasn't so much about income, it wasn't so much about I need to make more money. The largest or the most significant reason was reasons about meaning. That the teachers felt overworked, they didn't feel supported. And these are existential issues. These are not issues that you could solve through the budget, right? Now, of course, value comes from how much you make. But what this research is suggesting is that there is an existential crisis in our education system. And that existential crisis is not just solved by money and policy, but it's solved by giving teachers and supporting teachers and educators by building and supporting their full humanity. So how do we do this? And how might we think about this sort of healing our system? How do we build these systems? A friend of mine, I was explaining this notion of toxicity to her. She is a botanist at UC Berkeley. And I was explaining this notion of toxicity and how it influences and impacts our well-being. And she said that, that's interesting, Shawn, like we do similar experiments around toxicity. And she said that in their labs at UC Berkeley, they take these plants and they put the plant in a chamber and they pump different types of toxic gas into the chamber. And what they do is try to measure how the plants respond to that gas. And most of the time, the plant dies. And as my friend Jasia was explaining this, I was like, Jasia, I'm talking about hope and healing, not death, right? No, I'm not talking about dying plants. And she said, no, I want you to listen to this experiment, because one time we didn't just put one plant into the chamber. We took a community of plants and we put them in the same chamber. And we put those same plants together. But when we pump gas into that chamber. But when we put all the plants in the chamber and pump toxic gas into it, something miraculous happened in the chamber. She said the plants began to pull out different nutrients out of the soil. And the plants began to metabolize those nutrients in a different way. And the plants actually began to emit a gas out of their leaves that cleaned up the toxic gas they were pumping into the chamber. They detoxified their environment. And I think that's an important metaphor for how we should be thinking about the work that we do in schools. That we need to think about not just addressing inequality by transforming the policies, but how do we actually create a healing opportunity that detoxifies ourselves, detoxifies our communities, detoxifies the policies that actually create and cause harm. In Stockton, California, I was doing this talk about healing in Stockton, California, just last month, and a teacher came up to me, and she had read this book, Hope and Healing, and she said to me, she said, Dr. Ginwright, what you're talking about, this detoxification, I know what you're talking about. And it's a middle school in Stockton, California. She said 60% of our young people come to school every day with some exposure to trauma. And it's not just the kind of violent trauma that you think is normalized, right, where you see someone shot, but it's mundane trauma, like the trauma of being hungry, the trauma of hope, all forms of trauma. And the district gives us one counselor for every 2 weeks. My teaching staff is stressed, Dr. Ginwright. They don't know what to do. And I don't know what to do, so I had to do something. So she tells me after I gave the talk. And immediately she said, can I have your phone number? And I said, why do you want my phone number? And she said, I just want to show you something. She said, we didn't have any money to create healing opportunities in our school, so we did this. We took a classroom and we made it into a spa. It's a place where any student, any faculty, the custodian, a parent, anybody could use this space at any time to be present so that we can rupture the frenzy of the day, because the school day is oftentimes so packed with meetings and all kinds of stuff that we don't even have a time to just sit and reflect. So if you walked into our care room, Dr. Ginwright, you would smell lavender. And there's soft music playing. And the only thing we ask for the students and anybody who's in there is just to be silent. Someone donated this couch, she said. We allow people to take naps if they need to. Now we know that this is not conventional therapy, but it's all we can do. And by doing this, by taking this classroom and creating spaces of reflection, just changing the light, the fragrance, what we've done is ruptured the frenzy of craziness. We're bringing our humanity into this school, Dr. Ginwright. I'm like, oh, that's why you wanted my phone number. And so what we're talking about healing is not some major sort of only theoretical idea about the necessity of our well-being in these systems. It doesn't take much. It just takes some courage to try something that allows us to disrupt the craziness of these systems. So then how do we then create sort of this radical healing in our system? In the book we call this process radical healing. And radical healing and a healing-centered approach does three things. The first is that it addresses the healing at the individual level. The second is that it transforms our relationships in our communities, interpersonal relationships. And third, it transforms the systems and the policies that cause the harm in the first place. Because if we think of this as simply as self-care, Right? This is not self-care. This is collective transformation. And that it claims that our well-being is our right, not some self-indulgent act. Because in systems that spiritually, emotionally, and morally harm, to claim one's well-being is the most courageous act of justice one can engage in. Oftentimes, as social justice advocates, we believe, and as I'll talk about and I'll show you in a second, hopefully I'll have that slide, but if not, I'll just talk through it. We believe that our job is to fight for justice. We believe that our job is to demand for justice. And that is necessary, but it's grossly insufficient. Because fighting is not sustainable. And while we need to fight, we also need to dream. And while we need to demand, we also need to reimagine. All of these processes that are critical for our human transformation. And so my graduate students, when we engage in this process, in our class we use these 5 principles in our work with radical healing. Go past that. So these 5 principles are culture, agency, relationships, meaning, and aspirations. These are the principles of radical healing. And that when we use these principles at the individual level, when we use these principles at our interpersonal level, and when we use these principles in our institutions, we begin to heal the wounds, the wounds that the systems have inflicted on our communities and in our families. The first is culture. And what we mean by culture is that we have to make explicit an awareness of our identities, our humanity, our ethnic history, our racial identities, other social identities. It says that I am human. I am not simply an employee. And when we claim our humanity, it means that we have to also embrace the holistic aspects of our lives. It means that that sometimes we have to create opportunities for us to bond in different ways. I can imagine, even in departments or in schools, sometimes the best that people know is their colleague's last name, right? But what culture says is that I want to understand your entire humanity. Like, who are you? What does it mean to be gay or lesbian? What does it mean to be black? What does it mean to be white working in a black school? This means that I'm not going to hide my identity, but grapple with what it means, what my identity means in this particular context. The second is agency. And agency means that we all have the ability to act. That when we act, we have the ability to transform at the individual level, the interpersonal level, and at the institutional level. And agency simply says that we can't just assume that racism and homophobia and these structural issues are deterministic. That is, that all we do is tinker away at these systems that cause us harm. Agency says I can take micro acts of justice. Micro acts are small things that we do, the kind of conversations we have, the language that we use, that over time has a profound impact on the ability to transform the system. I like using the analogy of the environmentalist movement. When you leave here today, for those of you who are drinking water, you're not going to just throw your water bottle away. You're going to put it in a recycling can. That little act has a profound impact on our environment, to sustain the earth. Just like that micro act of agency, by taking your water bottle and putting it in a recycle, I believe that we can do the same for our own well-being. It means that we can have kinder words with young people. It means that we can. I was at a school in Texas, and the teachers were saying that the principal stands out in front of the school every day, and one day the child came up to the principal. The child was emotionally distraught, and the principal wanted to give the child a hug, but she didn't, because the policy said you cannot touch children. Right? So sometimes our policies, while well-meaning, still separate us from our humanity. It is human nature to be empathetic, right? So when we have to re-evaluate our policies in ways that allow us to reconnect with who we are as human beings. Third is relationships. There are 2 kinds of relationships we have in our society. We're trained primarily in transactional relationships. Those transactional relationships, while efficient, they are not effective for healing and transformation. So we need to shift from transactional relationships to transformative relationships. And transformative relationships mean that I know you I know you as a human being. I don't know, a transactional relationship says, you're a principal, I'm a teacher. I'm a teacher, you're a parent. Or I'm the professor and you're the student. It's just efficient transaction. And those systems are, while they're efficient, we have to begin to nurture transformative relationships. Transformative relationships say, I know you. I know your vulnerabilities. I know what you're struggling with. I was when we were doing a training around this at a school, they asked me and my colleague to come into this school district. Actually, it's one particular school. And the superintendent wanted to fire this principal. And they asked us to come in to see if they could do something about the relationships, because the principal was very sharp-tongued. Nobody liked her. When I met her, I was like, ooh, you sharp-tongued. She said something in her mind. I can see why, the parents wanted her fired, the students didn't like her, her staff, right? She was very, very, very difficult to get along with. So they asked us to come in, and we did a long healing process, healing circle. And the first thing we started with was shifting transactional relationships to transformative relationships. And as I began to share, the principal said, I know I've been difficult to work with. And I know it's been a challenge to work with me. And her staff was like, yeah, whatever. And she said, you may not know this, but earlier this year I was diagnosed with cancer. And her staff completely shifted from anger to empathy. She shared something about herself, not about her job, y'all. And in doing that, she was able to let her humanity show up. And in that moment, right, her staff could see her as a human being, not just a principal. Now, when you create transformative relationships, there are miraculous things that can happen. Different conversations can happen. Different ways of thinking about how to work together can happen. And so what happened at this school is the conditions were laid for some other way that teacher could engage with her students and her staff. Meaning is constantly reminding ourselves, separating ourselves from the frenzy of life to remind ourselves that our work is bigger than us. What meaning do we make about who we are and what we do in this work? And sometimes the jobs that we have in schools and education, we oftentimes get so caught up in the frenzied work style that we forget to remind ourselves the broader meaning making that the legacy that we're trying to achieve. The last is aspirations. The aspirations, I think, are probably, for me, one of the most significant. Because aspirations say that that it is part of our justice responsibility to dream beyond the misery. And oftentimes, we are trained, as I'm trained as a sociologist, to measure misery, to document pain, to articulate the most egregious acts of injustice. And while it's necessary to name it, naming it does not transform it. What transforms it is the ability to dream beyond it. And as we dream beyond it, we automatically solve that particular problem. My students, man, a few years ago, they had an assignment around, I gave them this assignment that I want you to use your imagination to solve the most pressing issue in education. And they said it was the hardest assignment. I'm like, you can't cite anybody. You can't cite anybody. I want you to use your imagination, because I believe that if we had the answer, that the answers are not going to come out of academics. We could talk about the problem, but the soul work that needs to be done is not going to come from here. So I'm trying to push them. And so they said, we're going to address the school-to-prison pipeline. And so they worked all semester. They came up with this great project to end the school-to-prison pipeline. And so they did their presentation at the end of the semester. And I said, okay, you ended the school-to-prison. They're so proud. We ended the school-to-prison pipeline, Dr. Ginwright. You said use our imagination. We ended the school-to-prison pipeline. I said, great. You get a C. They're like, oh, really? I was just trying to get their attention. But I said the reason I'm saying you're getting a seat, I didn't give them a seat, is that while you've ended the school to prison pipeline, you failed to create anything. You didn't use your imagination for creation, you used it for destruction. And while we need to end certain things, right, the absence of illness does not constitute well-being. The absence of violence does not constitute peace. The absence of the school to prison pipeline does not constitute flourishing and learning. And so we have to encourage our graduate students and our students to think courageously about not just ending the things that we don't want to see, but how do we think about creating it? And this is critically important for those who are working in the youth development field who say, we want to end bullying. We want to reduce violence. Violence reduction is such a low bar, y'all, because nobody wants to live in a violently reduced neighborhood. We want to live in a neighborhood that's full of peace, right? We want to live in a neighborhood that's full of peace and connections and connectedness, right? So if we think about only measuring that which we don't want, that's what we get. We get the lowering of misery, not the increasing of the thing we want. I'm going to be on a panel tomorrow that is a violence prevention strategy panel, right? And if we only talk about the reduction of violence, then we never develop the metrics of what we really want. What we really want is deep connection. What we really want is peace. What we really want is people to relate to one another. And if we think about it, we can develop the metrics to make it real. So how do we begin to change our language around aspiration? So I said before that oftentimes we use in the justice field these confined words: fight, defend, struggle, right? Now those words on the left, these confined words, are necessary words. We need to integrate that into our thinking and our doing of justice. But it's only half of the equation. And oftentimes, we don't use the words on the right to imagine, to dream, to discover, to create. That these words on the right force us to see beyond the conditions that we face. So, here are some quick recommendations that I think we can think about in terms of building a radical healing strategy in our work and in the transformation of our schools. The first is to increase the supports for staff to integrate healing practices into their day-to-day engagement with students. How are we thinking seriously about the well-being of staff and teachers? The second is to build systems of support for teachers to strengthen their own social emotional growth and well-being. This means that we can't think about social emotional learning as only good for young people, right? But we also have to think about it as it relates to the social emotional growth of the adults. I was talking to some African American teachers, and they were trying to get their African American students to do social emotional learning. And one of the things I said to them, I said, how many emotions do you talk about with your students? Because black boys and black men, generally, and my son as well, he's guilty of this, right? We generally have 3 emotions that we articulate, no matter how we feel. I'm good, I'm all right, I'm straight, right? That's kind of how we, right? We can, it doesn't matter what happens to, I'm good, I'm all right, I'm straight. And that emotion, right, that's our emotional vocabulary. That's the limit of our emotional vocabulary. We're not trained to say I'm afraid. Right? I'm scared, I'm embarrassed, I'm shameful. Right? These are emotions that have currency and power. And so in our thinking about social emotional growth, we have to provide supports for teachers to be able to do that in their classrooms. How do we expect young people to do it if the adults are not doing it? We need to create healing-centered, not trauma-informed opportunities for students, right? That this notion of trauma-informed typically labels young people as a problem. This is the worst thing that's happened. You are the worst thing that happened to you. And we know that trauma is not the worst thing that happens. Something happens, but you're more than just the thing that happens to you. I skipped this one. We need to track measures of wellness in schools and school districts, right? So while academic performance is necessary, we also know, and the research suggests that well-being and climate is not the same as well-being, y'all. School climate means we just kind of, you might just be PC, right? School climate isn't an indicator of well-being. Well-being takes into account our physical, emotional, spiritual realities of what comes up in schools. And I did say the term spiritual because these are existential issues. And that if we don't put spirituality, right, on this table and center it, right, again, we're missing part of our humanity. We need to create equity-based social-emotional learning strategies. Again, equity-based social-emotional learning says that the kind of social-emotional growth African-American and Latino students need is not the same as white kids in the suburbs. So we can't think of grit. In many ways, the notion of grit might actually reproduce harm for young people. Because it says that if you are not sucking it up enough, and if we miscalculate concepts like grit, then we're sending the wrong message to young people. An equity-based social-emotional learning strategy says what you need is actually your social-emotional learning strategy should be focused on your identity, or it should be focused on your language acquisition, or be focused on something else. But the way in which we're talking about social-emotional learning presumes that it's the same for all students. And then lastly, we need to support educational leaders with transformative change over professional development, right? Again, transformative change means that I'm focusing on the transformation of your humanity. And that by investing in the transformation of your humanity, we get a better teacher. But it doesn't work the other way around, y'all. In other words, by focusing on your professional development doesn't mean that you become a transformed human. And so by focusing on the transformation, right, of our human spirit, we show up differently at work. Now this means a completely different model of what we're thinking about. It means that we have to learn to be vulnerable. It means that we have to learn to take off our professional hats. It means that we have to learn to relate to one another differently. But all of these things create an opportunity for us to transform who we are. I want to end with this quote by Michelle Alexander, who in my view is one of the most brilliant intellectual minds of our time since W.E.B. Du Bois. You know, Michelle Alexander wrote the book, The New Jim Crow. And Michelle Alexander is a profound and prolific legal scholar. It's documented the ways in which our system in America, our justice system is in many ways reproduced or recreated slavery. And 3 years ago, Michelle Alexander, after having dedicated her life to legal arguments, to studying law, to revealing the savage inequalities in our justice system, she said in the New York Times that she wasn't practicing or writing about law anymore. And she was enrolling herself into the Union Theological School. And the reason she said that is that she says that fundamentally in America, the problems that we face are not policy problems. They are not policy. They're not problems of policy. They're not problems of strategy. But fundamentally in America, the problems that we face are spiritual problems. And that if we're able to explore that terrain of our spiritual growth and development, that perhaps we can come up with more profound answers to transform our society. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
So you know how we make executive decisions? We were going to end at 6, but he went over, but that was all right, right? Yeah. So I think part of what we're dealing with is all the time constraints. We can maybe take 2 questions. It says take 2 questions, and then Dr. Ginwright will be out, and there's copies of his book, and maybe you can talk with each other. He's given us so much to talk about. So let's kind of take 2 questions. Is that good?
Sure.
And then stay here. All right, questions? Okay.
Hi, my name's Eddie. I just had a question about ignorance is bliss. So how do you heal somebody that doesn't want to heal, even though they are currently in, a toxic environment?
So your question is how do you heal someone who doesn't want to be healed?
Yes.
So healing is a natural human process. When we're wounded, we naturally lean towards a process of healing. And so it's not a matter of someone not wanting to be healed, it's a matter of the conditions that are present for one to facilitate healing. And so so healing happens whether, like, if you get in a wound, right, your body's gonna heal. And so it's the same thing with with other kinds of issues that we have or other kind of wounds that we have. And so healing occurs naturally, so it doesn't require someone to be willing to do it. What is important is the conditions that need to be present for it to occur. And so what generally happens is, like in our schools, where young people need to be healed, the institution itself doesn't provide the space or the conditions to facilitate healing.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I had a question. Thank you so much for that. I had a question about whether you've seen examples of bigger systems, like school districts, really sort of adopting that, working in a large system. I feel it's really hard to sometimes move things like that. To talk about healing or humanizing our practice.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. So we are doing some work in a couple of places. One, we're beginning some work, and we're calling it healing-centered strategy in schools and school districts. And so one way that we're looking at it right now is we're actually working with a foundation in Omaha, Nebraska. And they are actually expanding this out beyond schools. And they're saying that they have an opportunity to do a healing-centered city, which means that the police department, the schools, juvenile probation, parks and recs, all can create more humanizing strategies in their systems to support young people of color in Omaha. We're just beginning that journey, so I don't have a district-wide or a system-wide process. But where we are beginning is with systems leaders to transform them. So when they come into the room, we're not going to be talking. We're not going to be working with them as the superintendent or the chief of police. We're going to be working with them as human beings. And that our idea is once we invest in their own transformation as human beings, that they will be able to see the way in which their humanizing and healing-centered practice can be implemented in their relative systems. So we're starting that work, but we haven't done it in an entire district just yet.
Joko, we have two more things. The first thing, thank you.
Thank you.
So one of the things we always love to do is to give a small award related to the work in social justice to our speaker, as they need to commemorate their being here with us and our appreciation for the work they're doing and for who they are as human beings in this very difficult world that we live in. So.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to ask Dr. Cheryl Grills to come up for a moment and make an announcement about this wonderful lecture that is happening. And I think that she best could speak to it.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you for this opportunity. Good evening, everyone. I wanted to invite you to continue this conversation as part of Black History Month, we have aligned the inaugural Dr. Ron Barrett lecture series in the psychology department here with the activities that have been launched across the university. So tomorrow in the Van der Rohe suite in the library on the top floor, we have Dr. Jacqueline Matisse, who is a professor of psychology at University of Michigan, speaking. She is the director of the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context, among other things. And her body of research directly aligns with what you've been listening to tonight in this wonderful presentation from Dr. Ginwright. Her work focuses on the link between religiosity, spirituality, positive psychology, as well as pro-social outcomes among African American and Afro-Caribbean youth and adults. And she explores altruism, compassion, forgiveness, and optimism among urban residing African American youth and adults. Her talk tomorrow is going to address the question, so really, what's good and right with Black life? We never hear those kinds of discussions. She's going to look at the issues of compassion, love, dignity, and kindness, factors that the social sciences often overlook, but our communities live and celebrate. So it's from 11:30 to 1:15 in Van der Rohe. If you have the time, please do come by and hear her talk. Thank you.
All right, so there is refreshments. We hope you'll hang around for a little while and talk with each other and mingle. And if you have an opportunity, I'm sorry? Oh, and there's a book signing. So if you get a book, Dr. Ginwright is here. Thank you again, and I hope that you'll continue to visit us at least once a year. For those of you that are community members, we really appreciate you coming to be in fellowship with us. Thank you.